Well, welcome back, everybody. It is time for our final installment of our latest eGroups series, Risk and Reward. I hope you've enjoyed the different conversations and discussions that we've had so far. And I'm pleased today to have another fantastic guest with us. We've got Pastor Steve Graham joining us today. So, hello, Pastor Steve. How are you?
Very good, thanks, Sam. Great to be here.
Very good. We're going to continue, as I said, talking about the theme for the year, risk and reward. The idea that actually God has moments for us in our lives where he's leading us, asking us to take risks. And the amazing thing is that as we do that for his name, for his kingdom, there's always a reward that comes out of it because of the goodness of God and because of how good he is. And so what we're going to do today is going to discuss one kind of final aspect of the whole risk and reward area. So Pastor Steve, I'm going to hand over to you. Talk us through what this kind of different risk and reward that you've got for us.
Okay, well, I kind of want to focus on a particular passage in the Old Testament.
Great.
So it's found in 1 Samuel chapter 14. So it's a story about Jonathan, the son of Saul, and it's a pretty famous incident. But for me, when you talk about risk and reward, I mean, this is kind of like the epitome of it. Shall I just explain a bit about the story?
Go for it.
Okay,
Fill us in.
So the story is that these two armies are gathered together. So the Philistines are preparing to attack the Israelites, and they're camped on opposite sides of these cliffs with this pass in between, and they're kind of a bit of a stalemate. Nothing's happening, and this young guy, Jonathan, just kind of has this bizarre idea, and it's found in verse 6. He just says, come on, let's go over. Like just two of them against a whole army to his young mate. And his rationale is this: perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. And it's like, almost what's the worst that can happen? Well, you could get killed by an army. But he's kind of like, why don't we just take a risk?
Yeah,
maybe God could do something extraordinary. And his logic is actually this: nothing can hinder the Lord from saving. So it's like, if God is in this, let's have a go.
Yeah, good.
And so, I mean, it's the most extraordinary story of risk, really, and there's an incredible reward.
Yeah, I love that idea, and it's a kind of in one sense, it's a kind of blasé phrase to say, isn't it? Like, well, if God's in it, let's just go for it. But the truth of it is, that's a real faith statement, isn't it? That's a real risk statement to go ahead and make, right?
Yeah, and it shows a really different spirit. In some ways, it's not surprising that only a couple of chapters later with David and Goliath, that Jonathan and David have this real kindred spirit. It's kind of like, man, we're just up for doing something. And the real contrast is with his father Saul, because it just, verse 2, it says Saul's at this camp, and it just said Saul was staying under a pomegranate tree. Like, he's sitting down under a tree in the shade eating his lunch. Like, he's the king. Like, come on, do something.
Yeah.
But he's not willing to take a risk. He's too comfortable.
Yeah.
And so there's a real contrast between him and his son Jonathan. Is like, let's have a go. Let's take a risk.
Yeah.
Who knows what could happen?
It's almost like the best way to take a risk, or the best way to move forward in your life, is to just give something a go, right?
Yeah,
Just say, okay, let's try something. Here we go.
There is a bit of a bit more weight to it then, because he does say, well, let's show ourselves, and if they say to us, the Philistines call out, hey, come on up, let's fight, they'll say, we'll take that as a sign from God. If they don't, we won't go. So they are kind of like, we do want to know God's in this, but they're really willing to take on impossible odds if they feel like God's in it.
Yeah. And I think that's the key thing to probably think about before we get to the reward. The question you want to ask yourself is God in this? Because I think some people will listen to what we're talking about, and you'll either be that kind of person who is a bit gung-ho, is like, okay, let's go for it, I'm ready. But there'll also be people watching tonight who are like, I prefer to, measure things out, weigh things up. But the truth is, the question, is God in this? No matter what side of the spectrum you're on, that's still a question you can always ask, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think it's almost like they're asking it with a different spirit and a different framework. Like, there's a battle for us to win.
Yes, yeah.
God, we just need to know, are you for us being part of this? Whereas Saul's just sitting back, and it's almost like, well, unless God, says something, I'm not going to take any action.
Yeah.
So I think it's like, let me at it. I want to make a difference.
Yeah.
We're part of something. Now, God, I just need to know you're going to be with us if we do this thing.
Absolutely. It's an active faith, isn't it? It's an active outworking of faith in action, basically, isn't it?
Yeah, because Saul, the opposite is, well, I'll just wait and see.
Yeah. Okay, so Jonathan, he goes for this risk. He takes it. He says, if God's in it, then let's go for it. Let's talk about where it ends up. Where do we go next?
Okay, well, interesting. So I actually want to finish by the process of them getting to the battle. But once they get there, they start this fight. And then in verse 15, it's just amazing. It says, then panic struck the whole army and the ground shook. It was a panic sent by God. And it's almost like if they were willing to take the first step, God comes in and adds his weight to it.
Great.
And almost, I don't know, maybe God's honored by their faith, by their risk-taking. And he's like, I'm going to put my weight behind what you're doing. And so a supernatural dimension kicks in, really, that is way beyond what they could do.
Well, do you think it's true in a way to say it's God responds to our faith, right?
Yeah, and they start the fight, and he's like, okay, I'm going to get behind this. But then actually it has quite an extraordinary impact on others. So down in verse 21, it just says, those Hebrews who had previously been with the Philistines and had gone up with them to their camp went over to the Israelites. And then verse 22, when all Israelites who had hidden in the hill country heard the Philistines were on the run, they joined the battle. And I guess this is the inspiring thing. To take a risk is not just, it impacts others. It wasn't just their victory. Somehow it ignited faith in other people that had surrendered, that had lost hope, that lived in fear. Suddenly when they saw this example, they're like, man, we could be part of this.
That's good.
And so, it inspired a whole generation of people to join in the battle as well.
And I love that thought because a lot of what we've talked about in our previous episodes has been a lot about taking the risk for yourself, not necessarily for yourself, but knowing, okay, this is me doing something and it's going to lead to something because God's called me to do it. But what we haven't talked about, which we're alluding to now, is that sense of actually you taking a risk for God really can bring God into so many other people's world. You don't know what it's
going to unlock in other people's lives.
That's fantastic.
And the inheritance that God has for you. And the conclusion's really interesting. It just says, so on that day, the Lord saved Israel and the battle moved on. And it's like, there's always more ground to take.
Yeah.
And so there's always opportunity to take more risks in God and see more ground taken, kind of. But this was a key kind of moment, and a great story of risk-taking.
Absolutely. What would your kind of, let's say someone was reading this passage and they came to you and said, Pastor Steve, I've read this, I've seen Jonathan had this risk-taking attitude. I know it led the kind of reward that it's got. And let's say they went, I feel like God's talking to me about this thing and I want to have this heart that Jonathan had. What would your advice be to them, or what would you say to them?
Well, I think there's all that stuff about understand the bigger picture of what God's doing. So you understand the battle. Seek God and as well that God is, I see this opportunity, something in me wants to do it. Partner with some key people. He didn't do it by himself. But I think one of the things that I wanted to really finish on is it kind of sounds like, I think some people are like, well, if God's in it, I'm happy to go along with it. If God suddenly breaks into my world, I'm all good with that. But actually, the risk wasn't just to step out and the miracle happened. He had to commit himself to it. There was a moment of determination and actually a thing of perseverance, which is kind of the thing I wanted to finish on. It just says, so the context, it says this, on each side of the pass that he intended to cross to reach them was a cliff, and these cliffs actually had names, Bozez and Senna. It wasn't just like a little I'll go for a wander and see what happens. Like, they had to scale two massive cliffs to get there. Like, he had to commit, and the one Bozez means shining. It's probably the sun's blasting down on that one, and the other one means thorny. It's probably covered in thorn bushes. So you get, you know what I mean? It's not like, I'll just wander into it. Like, he had to commit to this. He'd be pretty determined to get down a cliff, cross a pass, and get up to the other side just to get into the battle. And the verse that I really love in all of this, verse 13, it just says, Jonathan climbed up on his hands and knees. Like, he's like, I'm determined.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm just going to like, it's not like, oh, well, I was willing, but the door didn't open. It's like, I'm going to do whatever it takes to get into this thing, and I'm going to persevere till I see the result.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a risk of like, oh, well, if it's God's will, or, oh, well, I had a little go, but it didn't work. It's like, no, the risk to actually commit, to be determined, and then to persevere. I think that's a real risk. Like, I don't have a plan B. Like, I'm going for this thing, and I'm going to persevere till I see it. I think that's another level of courage and risk-taking.
And I think as well, and this is maybe the last thing we'll mention, it's that almost that change from a statement that says, if God's in this, I'm willing to take the risk. It becomes more like, because God's in this, I'm going to go after this risk. And probably because the reward is worth it, right? It's worth it to see what God's got, the kingdom of God, and how it can grow and develop and expand and be in action because of the risk that we might be willing to take. Yeah, that's good. Well, have a brilliant discussion tonight, the final one of this series. And I hope that over this last couple of weeks in your eGroups, you've found some moments to really unpack, discover, and go on the journey of finding some risks that you might be willing and up for taking in 2025. Like we've just talked about, if God's in it, then it is a risk worth taking. Because God's in it, it's a risk worth taking. Let's go on that incredible risk-taking journey as a church together this year. Have a brilliant discussion, and we'll see you soon.